I came home a day early, and what I saw in my son's room made something inside me break forever. I remember standing in the doorway, not moving, not breathing. The hallway was quiet, but it wasn't a good kind of quiet. It was the kind of quiet that tells you something is very, very wrong. I heard it before I saw it, a sound, something hitting the floor, and then another. I pushed the door open slowly, and right there, in the middle of the room, was my father, standing straight, arms crossed, looking at the floor like he'd just finished a job. Scattered across the carpet were Noah's things, the photos, the Little League trophy, the birthday card my son had saved for 2 years, and the keepsake box, the one thing my son held onto after his dad died, was open, half empty. My son sat on the edge of his bed, completely still. His face was blank. Not sad, not crying. Just gone. Right then, before my father even said a word, I felt a cold wave move through my entire body. And then my father looked up at me, completely calm, and said with a flat voice, "I'm just cleaning out the weakness." At that moment, I didn't just feel anger, I felt something much worse. Regret. Because 3 days earlier, I was the one who left my son there. Hi everyone, my name is Emily. I'm 41 years old, and I work as an ER nurse in Chicago. The story I'm about to tell you happened less than a year ago, but it changed everything about how I see family, how I see trust, and honestly, how I see myself as a mother. I want to be upfront with you. This isn't easy to talk about, but I think it needs to be said. So let's go back. About 10 months before that moment in my son's room, my ex-husband Daniel died in a car accident on a Tuesday morning. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't drinking. A truck ran a red light, and that was it. Gone. Just like that. Noah was 13 at the time. And Daniel, even though we'd been divorced for 2 years, was still very much his dad. They talked every single day. They went fishing together on weekends. Daniel showed up to every school event, every game, every recital. He was present in a way that a lot of dads aren't. And then one morning, he wasn't there anymore. After the funeral, Noah stopped talking. Not completely, but almost. He stopped eating at the table with me. He stopped playing with his friends. His teachers started calling. His grades dropped. He'd wake up in the middle of the night and just sit in the hallway, not saying anything, just sitting there in the dark. I got him into therapy as fast as I could. His therapist, Dr. Lena Park, was patient and kind, and Noah, slowly, very slowly, started to open up. But it was a long road. Meanwhile, I was working 12-hour shifts at the ER, coming home exhausted, trying to be everything for my son while barely holding myself together. There was one thing Noah kept close to him, through all of it. A wooden box, about the size of a shoebox. Daniel had given it to him the Christmas before he died. Inside were little things, a photo of the two of them at a Cubs game, a handwritten note that Daniel had tucked in there as a joke, but Noah kept it like it was gold. A small compass, a few ticket stubs. Nothing that would mean anything to anyone else. But to Noah, that box was everything. It was the last piece of his dad he could hold in his hands. Every night before bed, I'd see him open it. Just look at the things inside, close it again. And I'd stand in the doorway and think, as long as he has that, he still has a piece of Daniel. At the time, I believed the worst thing that could happen to my son had already happened. I was wrong. My father, Robert, hadn't been a regular part of our lives for years. That wasn't an accident. Robert Carter was the kind of man who believed that emotions were a sign of weakness, that therapy was for people who couldn't handle real life, and that children needed to be molded, not comforted. Growing up with him wasn't easy. He wasn't violent. But he was cold in a way that left marks you couldn't see. When I was 9 and cried because my dog died, he looked at me from across the kitchen and said with zero expression, "Pull yourself together, crying won't bring it back." That was my dad. So when I got older, got married, built my own life, I naturally put some distance between us. It wasn't a dramatic falling out. It was more like a slow, quiet drift. We'd talk on holidays, exchange a few texts here and there, but he wasn't in my daily life, and honestly, that felt right. Then Daniel died. And out of nowhere, my father showed up. At first, I was actually surprised. He came to the funeral. He sat in the back, didn't say much, but he was there. A few weeks later, he started calling more, checking in, asking how Noah was doing. And I want to be honest with you, part of me was grateful. I was drowning. I was working full-time, raising a grieving teenager alone, barely sleeping, and here was my father, offering to help. So I let him back in. Slowly at first. He'd come over on Sunday afternoons, bring groceries sometimes, sit in the living room while Noah did homework. It seemed fine. It seemed like maybe he had changed, but then the comments started. Small ones at first, easy to dismiss. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after he started coming around, he watched Noah flip through the keepsake box at the kitchen table. Noah had it open and was just quietly looking at the photos inside. My father sat across from him, watching, and then said in a low, steady voice, "You know, keeping all that stuff around isn't helping him move on." I looked up from the counter and told him calmly, "It helps him feel connected, Dad. His therapist actually encourages it." Without missing a beat, he leaned back in his chair and replied with a dismissive tone. His therapist. Right. You're paying someone to tell a 13-year-old boy it's okay to cry over old pictures. I didn't respond. I let it go. That was my mistake. Because what I should have recognized right then was that this wasn't a difference of opinion. This was my father telegraphing exactly what he believed and exactly what he intended. A few weeks after that, I noticed Noah got quiet whenever my father was around. Not the same kind of quiet as after Daniel died. This was different. It was a guarded quiet. A careful quiet, like a kid who's learned to make himself small, so he doesn't get noticed. One evening, after my father left, I sat next to Noah on the couch and asked him gently, "Hey, you good? You seemed a little off tonight." Noah shrugged and said without looking at me, "Grandpa says I need to man up." I felt something tighten in my chest right then. I asked him, keeping my voice steady, "What exactly did he say to you?" Noah hesitated, then answered quietly. He said grieving this long means, "I'm weak," that Dad would be embarrassed. The air went out of the room. I sat there for a second, just processing that. Then I told Noah firmly, looking straight at him, "That is not true. Not even a little bit. You hear me?" Noah nodded, but he didn't look convinced. And that right there should have been the moment I shut the whole thing down. I should have picked up the phone that night and told my father he wasn't welcome around my son anymore. But I didn't. I told myself it was just one comment, that I'd talk to him, that he'd back off. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be completely wrong. Looking back, the warning signs were there. Every single one of them. I just chose not to see them. It was supposed to be just 3 days. That's what I kept telling myself. 3 days. 72 hours. What could possibly go wrong in 72 hours? The hospital had scheduled a mandatory emergency response training up in Milwaukee. 3 days, 2 nights. It wasn't optional. If I didn't complete it, I'd lose a certification I'd spent years building. And normally, this wouldn't have been a problem. I had a backup plan. My neighbor, Carol, had watched Noah before, and he liked her. She was warm and easy, and knew how to give him space without making him feel alone. But Carol called me 4 days before the training, with a shaky voice and said, "Emily, I'm so sorry. My mom had a stroke last night. I have to fly out to Phoenix first thing tomorrow." Right after I hung up, a heavy feeling settled in my stomach. I stood in the kitchen, staring at my phone, running through options in my head. Noah's school schedule, my work schedule, the training I couldn't skip. I called 2 other friends. One was out of town, the other had her own family emergency. I scrolled through my contacts twice, maybe 3 times, and then I stopped on my father's name. I stared at it for a long moment. The conversation about Noah manning up was still sitting in the back of my mind. But I also thought about the past few weeks. My father had been calmer. He hadn't made any more comments, at least not that I'd heard. He'd been showing up, being present, helping around the house without being asked. Maybe I'd gotten through to him. Maybe that one conversation I had with him, where I told him firmly that Noah needed compassion right now, not toughness, maybe it had actually landed. So I called him. He picked up on the second ring. I explained the situation, keeping it straightforward, and asked him, "Dad, I need someone to stay with Noah for 3 days while I'm at this training. Would you be willing to do that?" There was a brief pause, and then he said with what sounded like genuine warmth, "Of course, that's what I'm here for." Something about how quickly he agreed made me pause for just a second, but I pushed past it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I couldn't keep treating my father like a threat when he was trying to show up. Before he came over, I pulled Noah aside and sat with him on the edge of his bed. I looked at him carefully and asked, "Hey, is it okay with you if Grandpa stays here while I'm gone? I know it's not your first choice, but I've run out of options and I really need your help here." Noah looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up at me and said in a small voice, "I guess it's okay." It wasn't enthusiasm, but it wasn't a hard no either, and I latched onto that. I went over the rules with my father before I left. I was specific. Noah's therapy appointment was Thursday at 4. He needed to be there. The keepsake box was not to be touched. Noah had his own way of processing things, and it needed to be respected. Dinner at 6, no later, because routine helped him sleep. My father stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, nodding along like I was reading him a grocery list. Right before I walked out the door with my bag, I turned back one more time and looked at him directly and said, "Dad, I mean it, don't push him. Just be there." He met my eyes and said without hesitation, "I know how to take care of a kid, Emily. Go do your job." I walked out to my car, threw my bag in the back seat, and sat there for a second with my hands on the wheel. Something in my gut was pulling at me, a quiet, uncomfortable feeling I couldn't quite name. But I had a flight to catch. I had a certification on the line, and I had convinced myself, against every instinct I had, that it would be fine. That night, as I packed my bag, I ignored the feeling in my gut, and that was my first mistake. While I was in Milwaukee learning how to save strangers' lives, my son was learning how unsafe home could be. I didn't know any of this while it was happening. I pieced it together later, from what Noah told me, from what his therapist helped him put into words over the following months. But I'm going to tell you what happened in that house during those 3 days, because you need to understand what my son went through while I was gone. The first morning, my father was up before Noah. When Noah came downstairs still in his pajamas, still half asleep, my father was already sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, fully dressed, watching the door like he'd been waiting. Without looking up from his mug, he said in a flat tone, "You're up late. In this house, we're dressed by 7. Noah looked at the clock. It was 7:12. He didn't say anything. He just went back upstairs and got dressed. That set the tone for everything that followed. My father imposed a schedule. Meals at specific times. No TV until all schoolwork was done and checked. Lights out at 9:30, which for a 13-year-old who was already struggling to sleep, felt more like punishment than structure. None of this was discussed with Noah. None of it was explained. It was just announced, and compliance was expected. By the first afternoon, my father had made his way into Noah's room. He stood in the doorway, looked around slowly, and then said, with a disapproving edge in his voice, "This room is a mess. Clean it up before dinner." Noah cleaned it. But while he was organizing his desk, my father picked up one of the framed photos sitting on the nightstand. It was a picture of Noah and Daniel at a fishing trip 2 summers ago. Both of them laughing, holding up a fish that was honestly too small to be proud of, but they were proud of it anyway. My father held it for a moment, studying it. Then he set it face down on the desk and said without emotion, "You don't need to be staring at that every night. It's not helping you. Noah didn't respond, but something shifted in him right then. That night, Noah tried to call me. I was in a training session that ran long, and my phone was on silent. I saw the missed call when I got back to my room, and I called him right back. When he picked up, I asked him warmly, "Hey buddy, sorry I missed you. Everything okay?" There was a pause. Then Noah said in a voice that was trying hard to sound normal, "Yeah, it's fine. Just wanted to say goodnight." I told him gently, "I love you. I'll call you first thing tomorrow, okay?" He said okay. And that was it. What I didn't know was that my father had been standing just outside the bedroom door while Noah made that call. And the moment Noah hung up, my father pushed the door open and said with a sharp tone, "You don't need to check in with your mom every 5 minutes. You're not a little kid." On the second day, things got worse. My father found the keepsake box. Noah had it on his bed, open, the way he always did in the afternoon when he got home from school. It was his quiet time, his way of feeling less alone. My father walked in, looked at the box, and then looked at Noah and said with cold certainty, "This is exactly the problem. You're holding on to the past instead of moving forward. That's why you're still struggling." Noah pulled the box closer to him and said with a tight voice, "Mom said not to touch it." My father crossed the room, reached down, and took the box right out of Noah's hands. He held it up and said in a hard, deliberate voice, "Your mom isn't here, and I'm telling you, this thing is doing you more harm than good." Noah sat completely still. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He just watched. And that stillness, that complete shutdown, was the most heartbreaking part of the whole story. Because that stillness meant Noah had already learned that expressing emotion in that house was not safe. My father put the box on the top shelf of the closet, out of reach. Then, before he walked out of the room, and my son sat alone on his bed, in total silence, with the last piece of his father locked away above him on a shelf he couldn't reach. By the second night, something in my son had already started to shut down, and I had no idea. Then my father called me, not about Noah, about money. It was the second night of the training. I was in my hotel room, sitting on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, too tired to even think about dinner. My phone buzzed on the nightstand and I saw my father's name on the screen. I picked up, assuming something had happened with Noah, and answered quickly, "Dad? Is everything okay?" His voice was calm, almost too calm. He said in an easy conversational tone, "Everything's fine. Noah's in bed. I actually wanted to talk to you about something else." Right then, a small alarm went off somewhere in the back of my mind, but I kept my voice steady and said, "Okay, what's going on?" He cleared his throat and then said in a measured, careful way, "I've been thinking about Daniel's life insurance payout. The money you got after the accident. I think it's sitting in the wrong place. I've got a contact, a guy I've known for 20 years, solid investment background, and he's got an opportunity that I really think you should look at. Family rates, low risk, strong return." I didn't say anything for a second. I just sat there, replaying what he'd just said in my head to make sure I'd heard it right. Then I asked him slowly, "You're calling me right now, while you're supposed to be watching my son, to talk to me about investing Daniel's life insurance money?" He didn't miss a beat. He replied in a tone that made it sound completely reasonable. "I'm doing you a favor. That money is just sitting there. Noah's going to need college tuition. You've got a mortgage, and you're leaving it in a basic savings account. That's not smart, Emily." Something tightened in my chest right then. Because that money wasn't just money. Daniel had that policy specifically for Noah. It was supposed to be untouched until Noah was ready for college. It was the one thing Daniel had left behind, that was practical, that was protective, that said, "I'm still here for you even when I'm not." My father knew that. I had told him that directly. I kept my voice even and said, "Dad, that money is for Noah. It's not an investment fund. It's not going anywhere." His tone shifted slightly then, just enough for me to notice. And he said with a thin edge underneath the calm, "I'm not saying take it all. I'm saying be smart with it. You could grow it significantly if you'd just listen for 2 minutes instead of being so stubborn about everything. And there it was. That word. Stubborn. The word he'd used my entire childhood whenever I disagreed with him. Whenever I had a different opinion. Whenever I stood my ground about anything at all. I took a slow breath and said firmly, "I'm not doing this, Dad. That money stays where it is. Can we talk about Noah? How is he actually doing?" There was a pause. A long one. Then he said with barely concealed frustration, "He's fine. He's sleeping. Though I'll tell you, that therapist of his isn't doing him any favors. Kid cries at the drop of a hat. He needs structure, not someone handing him tissues every week." My jaw tightened. I asked him in a careful, controlled voice, "What exactly has been going on over there, Dad?" Because Noah called me last night and he didn't sound fine. His answer came quickly, too quickly, and he said with complete dismissal, "He's 13 and dramatic. Stop treating him like he's made of glass. That's why he can't cope, Emily. Because you've convinced him he's fragile." The words landed hard. I sat there with the phone against my ear, staring at the wall of that hotel room, and I felt something shift inside me. Not just anger. Something colder than anger. A deep, sinking recognition that I had handed my son to someone who saw his grief as a character flaw. I told him in a quiet, final voice, "We're done talking about this tonight. I'll be home in 2 days." He made a short sound, something between a laugh and a scoff, and said before I could hang up, "You know, this is exactly why he's struggling. He needs a man in his life who's going to set him straight, and instead he's got you running his whole world on feelings." I ended the call. I sat in that hotel room for a long time after that. The TV was off. The room was completely silent. My hands were in my lap, and I was staring at nothing. When I hung up that call, I knew something wasn't right. Something was happening in that house that went beyond strict routines and old-fashioned opinions, but I still didn't understand how bad it was. I changed my flight before sunrise. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay on top of the hotel bed covers, still dressed, staring at the ceiling while the room hummed with that low, hollow sound that hotel rooms make at 2 a.m. when everything else is quiet. My mind kept circling back to the phone call. The way my father talked about Noah's grief like it was a bad habit he needed to break. The way he brought up Daniel's insurance money with the same casual tone you'd use to talk about the weather. The way he said that's why he's struggling like he'd already diagnosed my son and written the prescription. Around 3 a.m, I sat up, grabbed my phone off the nightstand, and tried calling Noah. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I told myself he was asleep. It was 3 a.m. Of course he was asleep. But the feeling in my stomach didn't go away. I tried again at 4. Same thing. Voicemail. Right at that moment, something in me made a decision before my brain had even fully caught up. I opened my laptop and pulled up the airline website. The next available flight back to Chicago left at 6:45. I booked it without hesitating. Then I sent a quick message to my supervisor, explaining there was a family emergency and I needed to leave the training early. I knew there would be consequences. I knew I'd have to make up the certification hours another time. I didn't care. I threw everything into my bag in about 10 minutes, checked out of the hotel while the front desk clerk was still half asleep, and drove to the airport in the dark. The whole drive there, I kept running through possibilities in my head. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Noah had just turned his phone off before bed and everything was completely fine. Maybe I'd walk in the door and my father would be making pancakes and Noah would be sitting at the table looking perfectly okay and I'd feel ridiculous for cutting the trip short. I wanted that to be true. I needed it to be true. But the closer I got to the airport, the more that quiet, persistent feeling in my gut told me it wasn't. I kept thinking about what Emma had sounded like on the phone 2 nights ago. That careful, controlled voice. That I'm fine that didn't sound like fine at all. I'd heard that voice before, in the months after Daniel died, when Noah was working so hard to hold everything together that he didn't have any room left to actually feel anything. I knew that voice. I knew what it meant. And I knew my father well enough to understand what 3 days of his version of tough love could do to a kid who was already barely holding on. I boarded the plane while it was still dark outside. I sat in the window seat and watched the runway lights blur past as we lifted off. By the time we leveled out above the clouds, the first pale light of morning was coming up on the horizon. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and I thought about Noah. About the keepsake box. About the way he'd looked the last time I saw him standing in the doorway waving goodbye, trying to look braver than he felt. I thought about my father's voice on the phone, that flat, certain tone he used when he believed he was absolutely right about something. That tone I'd grown up around. That tone that left no room for anything soft or uncertain or human. The cab ride home from O'Hare felt like it took forever. Every red light felt personal. I sat in the back seat with my bag on my lap, watching the Chicago streets slide past the window, the city still waking up around me, and I counted the minutes. When we finally turned onto my street, I leaned forward slightly and looked at the house through the windshield. Everything looked normal from the outside. Quiet. The curtains were drawn. My father's car was in the driveway. Nothing looked wrong, but nothing could have prepared me for what I walked into. I opened the front door with my key. The house was quiet, too quiet for 9 in the morning. I set my bag down in the entryway and stood still for a second, just listening. The kitchen was empty. The living room was empty. The TV was off. I called out in a calm voice, not wanting to startle anyone. "Noah? Dad? I'm home." Nothing. I walked down the hallway toward Noah's room, and that's when I heard it. A sound coming from behind the closed door. Something hitting the floor. Then another. Then what sounded like cardboard scraping against wood. I pushed the door open, and time just stopped. My father was standing in the middle of the room with his back half turned to me. On the floor around him were Noah's things. The framed photos that had been on the nightstand were face down on the carpet. The small shelf above the desk had been cleared off. The Little League trophy and the birthday cards Noah had kept since he was 8 were piled in a box by the door like they were being prepped for the trash. And the keepsake box, Noah's keepsake box, was open on the bed, empty. The compass was gone. The ticket stubs were gone. The handwritten note from Daniel, the one Noah treated like it was made of gold, was sitting crumpled on top of a pile of things my father had clearly decided didn't belong in a healthy boy's room. Noah was sitting on the far edge of the bed, pressed against the wall, knees pulled up to his chest, arms wrapped around his legs. His face was completely blank, not crying, not angry, just empty. The way a person looks when they've gone somewhere inside themselves, because outside isn't safe anymore. My father turned around when he heard me. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look guilty. He looked at me with that same calm, certain expression he'd worn my entire childhood. The look that said he knew exactly what he was doing and had zero doubt about any of it. Before I could say a single word, he gestured toward the pile on the floor and said in a completely steady voice, "I'm just cleaning out the weakness." The room tilted. That's the only way I can describe it. The room tilted and every sound disappeared, and for a second I couldn't feel my own feet on the floor. I looked at Noah. Noah was staring at the crumpled note on top of the pile. The last thing his dad had written him. Sitting there like garbage. And something inside me, something I hadn't even known was holding itself together until that exact moment, came completely apart. I crossed the room in 3 steps, picked up the note, smoothed it out carefully with both hands, and placed it back inside the keepsake box. My hands were shaking. I was aware of that, but my voice, when it came, was very quiet and very controlled. I looked at my father and said in a low, measured tone, "Don't say another word." He straightened up slightly and replied with that infuriating calm, "Emily, you need to hear this. That boy has been drowning in grief for almost a year because you keep handing him permission to stay stuck. I'm doing what you haven't been willing to do." I looked at Noah. His eyes hadn't moved from the box in my hands. He was so still it scared me. I sat down on the edge of the bed next to him, close enough that our arms were touching, and I said softly, just to him, "Hey, I'm here. I'm right here." Noah didn't say anything. He just leaned, slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward me. And that tiny movement, that small, exhausted lean, broke me completely open. I stood back up and turned to face my father. The shaking in my hands had moved into my chest by then, but my voice stayed level and I said, looking straight at him, "You took his things. You took the last things he had of his father, and you treated them like junk. Do you understand what you just did?" My father looked at me without flinching and said with absolute conviction, "I understand that somebody in this family had to make a hard call. You've been so busy feeling sorry for him that you couldn't see he was using that box as an excuse not to heal." The cold clarity that moved through me right then wasn't something I'd ever felt before. It wasn't rage, though rage was absolutely part of it. It was something more final than rage. It was the moment you understand, completely and without any remaining doubt, exactly who someone is. I looked at my father, this man I had let back into our lives, this man I had trusted with the most important person in my world, and I said in a voice so quiet, it was almost a whisper, "Get out of this room." He opened his mouth to respond. I said it again, and this time there was nothing quiet about it. "Get out of his room right now." For the first time since I'd walked through that door, something flickered across my father's face. Not remorse, not quite, but something that looked like the first recognition that he had miscalculated. He walked past me without another word and out into the hallway. I turned back to Noah. He was still pressed against the wall, arms around his knees, but his eyes had found mine now. And in his eyes I saw something that made my throat close up completely. Not anger, not even sadness, just exhaustion. The profound, bone-deep exhaustion of a kid who had spent 3 days trying to survive in a house where everything he felt was treated like a flaw. I sat back down next to him and put my arm around his shoulders and pulled him close. He didn't resist. He just folded into me, pressed his face against my shoulder, and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 3 days straight. I held him and looked at the mess on the floor around us, the scattered photos, the cleared shelves, the empty spaces where his memories had been. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't something I could fix with words. I stayed with Noah for a long time. I didn't rush it. I didn't try to fill the silence with reassurances or explanations. I just held him and let him breathe. After a while, his shoulders relaxed a little, his breathing slowed down. I pressed a kiss to the top of his head and said very quietly, "I'm going to go talk to Grandpa for a minute. You stay here. I'll be right down the hall." Noah looked up at me and said in a small, careful voice, "Are you going to yell at him?" I looked at my son's face, this exhausted, guarded, 13-year-old face that had seen way too much in the past year, and I told him honestly, "I don't know, but whatever happens, it's not your problem to worry about. Okay?" He nodded. I got up, walked out of his room, and pulled the door gently closed behind me. My father was in the living room. He was sitting in the armchair by the window, the one that faced the front yard, with his hands folded in his lap like he was waiting for a meeting to start. Like he hadn't just dismantled my son's entire sense of safety over the course of 3 days. He looked up when I walked in. Before he could say anything, I sat down across from him on the couch, leaned forward with my elbows on my knees, and looked him dead in the eye. For the first time in my life, I didn't stay quiet. I said in a steady, deliberate voice, "I need you to explain to me, in your own words, what you thought you were doing in that room." He shifted slightly in the chair and replied in a tone that was still maddeningly reasonable. "I was doing what needed to be done. That boy is 13 years old. He can't spend the rest of his life carrying around a box of keepsakes like a security blanket. At some point, someone has to push him forward." I kept my eyes on his face and said, "His therapist, the one with an actual degree in child psychology, says the exact opposite. She says the box is a healthy coping tool. She says it helps him maintain a connection to his dad while still functioning in the present. But you know better than her, right? He waved his hand slightly and said with open dismissal, "Therapists. They tell people what they want to hear, because that's how they keep getting paid. You want your son to be in therapy until he's 30? Keep going the way you're going." Something hot moved through my chest right then, but I kept my voice controlled and said, "You told him his dad would be embarrassed of him. You told a grieving 13-year-old boy that his dead father would be ashamed of how he's handling losing him. Do you actually understand how cruel that is?" My father's jaw tightened slightly. He said with a clipped certainty, "I told him the truth. His father was a strong man. He wouldn't have wanted his son falling apart over him." I stood up then. I couldn't stay sitting anymore. I walked to the window and stood with my back to him for a second, looking out at the front yard, collecting myself. Then I turned around and said in a voice that was shaking just slightly at the edges, "You want to talk about truth? Let's talk about truth. You did the same thing to me, my entire childhood. Every time I was scared, every time I was sad, every time I needed something from you that looked even slightly like comfort, you called it weakness. You told me to pull myself together. You made me feel like having feelings was a personal failure, and I spent 20 years trying to unknot all of that damage." His expression shifted. Something moved across his face that I couldn't quite read. He said in a quieter tone, "I raised you to be strong, and you are strong. You're a single mother working an ER job and holding everything together. I did something right." I shook my head slowly and said, "You didn't make me strong, Dad. I became strong in spite of you. There's a difference. And it's a difference I spent a lot of money in therapy figuring out." That landed. I could see it land. His hands shifted in his lap. His chin came up slightly the way it always did when he was recalibrating. Then he looked at me and said in a low, flat voice, "So everything is my fault. Your divorce, Noah's grief, all of it. I'm the villain in your story." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had never once in my memory said "I love you" without it being attached to a condition. This man who measured worth in accomplishments and called tenderness a liability. This man who had sat across from my grieving son and told him his dead father would be embarrassed of him. And I said very quietly, "I don't think you're a villain, Dad. I think you're someone who learned a long time ago that being hard was the only way to survive, and you never figured out how to stop. And I have a lot of compassion for that. I do, but compassion doesn't mean I let you near my son." His eyes narrowed and he said sharply, "So that's it. You're cutting me off again." Just like that. I didn't look away from him. I said, "I'm not cutting you off. I'm protecting my child. Those are two completely different things. And I need you to understand that what happened in that room today is not something I can move past. You didn't just overstep. You went into my son's room and you systematically destroyed every boundary I set. You took the one thing that connects him to his father and you treated it like trash. And then you called it help." My father was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a voice that was harder now, the warmth completely gone, "You're making a mistake. Kids need boundaries. They need structure. They need someone who doesn't let them wallow." I took a slow breath and said, "Noah has boundaries. He has structure. He has a therapist, a school counselor, a mom who shows up for every single appointment, and a community of people who love him. What he doesn't have, and what he will never again have, is someone in his life who tells him his grief is a character flaw." My father stood up from the chair. He was taller than me, and he used that height the way he always had, squaring his shoulders, drawing himself up to his full size. He looked down at me and said with a cold finality, "You're going to regret this." I met his eyes without stepping back. And then I said the one thing I never thought I would say to him. I said, quietly and completely without anger, "I already regret it, Dad. I regret every single warning sign I ignored. I regret letting you back in. I regret leaving Noah with you. That's my regret to carry. But I will not regret what I'm about to do next." I told him to get out, and I meant forever. My father stood in the living room for a moment, looking at me like he was waiting for me to take it back, Like this was just another argument that would blow over in a few days the way our arguments always had when I was growing up. But I didn't take it back. I held the front door open and looked at him and said without raising my voice, "Take your bag and go, Dad. I'm not asking twice." Something in my tone must have finally told him I was serious. He walked to the guest room, picked up his overnight bag, came back through the living room without looking at me, and walked out the front door. I closed it behind him. I stood there, with my hand still on the doorknob, and listened to his car start in the driveway and pull away. And then it was just quiet. In the days that followed, I called a family attorney. I didn't know exactly what legal options I had, but I needed to understand them. The attorney walked me through what documentation I should keep, what Noah's therapist could provide in writing if it ever came to that, and what steps I could take to formalize the boundary I'd already drawn. Knowing I had options made the ground feel slightly more solid under my feet. Then came the family. My aunt called first. She'd heard from my father, of course, and her version of events was that I had completely overreacted and thrown a good man out of his grandson's life over a minor disagreement about parenting. She said in a measured but pointed tone, "Emily, he's your father. He loves Noah. You can't just cut people off every time they do something you don't agree with." I let her finish. Then I told her calmly, "I hear you, and I'm not going to argue about it. But I need you to understand that what happened here wasn't a disagreement about parenting styles, and I'm not changing my mind." She didn't call back after that. 2 cousins sent messages. My father's older brother left a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes and used the phrase "tearing the family apart" 3 separate times. Each one of those messages landed like a small weight added to an already heavy load. Because part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime trying to earn approval from people who moved the goalposts every time I got close, felt the pull of it, the guilt, the pressure. The old familiar voice that said, "Maybe you're being too extreme, maybe you should just talk it out, maybe family is worth one more chance." But then I'd go check on Noah. And I'd see the way he flinched sometimes when a door opened too fast. The way he'd gone quieter than usual, even by his post-Daniel standards. His therapist told me 2 weeks after the incident, in a calm but serious voice, what Noah experienced was a form of emotional abuse. The removal of the keepsake box, the verbal shaming, the isolation from you. That's going to take time to work through. More time than we'd built up before this happened. Right after she said that, a wave of grief moved through me so heavy I could barely sit upright in the chair. Grief for my son. Grief for the progress we'd lost. And underneath all of it, a grief I hadn't expected. The grief of finally accepting, completely and without any remaining hope, that my father was never going to be the person I needed him to be. At that point, I had lost more than just my father. I had lost the idea of what family meant. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I left everything behind. 3 months after I told my father to walk out that door, I put our house in Chicago on the market. I requested a transfer through the hospital network and accepted a position at a smaller facility in Madison, Wisconsin. Less money, fewer hours, a quieter life. People thought I was crazy. A colleague pulled me aside in the break room one afternoon and said with genuine concern, "Emily, you've built your whole career here. You're really going to walk away from all of that?" I looked at her and said without hesitation, "I'm not walking away from my career. I'm walking toward my son." We moved on a Saturday in early spring. Noah helped carry boxes. He didn't say much, but at one point he stopped in the doorway of our new living room, looked around at the empty space, and said quietly, "It smells different here." I asked him gently, "Good different or bad different?" He thought about it for a second. Then he said, "Just different, like it doesn't have any bad memories yet." That sentence stayed with me for a long time. In Madison, we settled into a slower rhythm. Noah started seeing a new therapist who specialized in adolescent grief. He rejoined a school soccer league. Some mornings he still woke up sad. Some nights were still hard. But slowly, in small and fragile ways, something in him started to come back. He laughed at dinner one night, a real laugh, and it stopped me completely. I just stood there holding a dish towel, watching him, trying not to cry. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time in a long time, it felt safe. It's been a year since that day, and my life looks nothing like it used to. Noah is 14 now. He still sees his therapist every week. He still has the keepsake box, sitting on his nightstand exactly where it belongs, with everything back inside it. The compass, the ticket stubs, Daniel's note, smoothed out and carefully folded. Some mornings I walk past his room and the door is cracked open and I can see him just sitting there with the box in his lap, quiet, remembering. And I don't interrupt. I just keep walking. Because that's not weakness. That's love. That's a kid who lost his dad and is figuring out how to carry that loss without being crushed by it. And that is something worth protecting. I have no contact with my father. I don't know if that's permanent. I don't know if there's a version of this story where he does the work, really does it, and earns his way back into our lives. But I know that right now, today, the boundary is necessary. And I've stopped apologizing for it. What I've learned this past year is something I wish I'd understood a long time ago. Trust your instincts, especially when it comes to your kids. That quiet, uncomfortable feeling I had before I left for Milwaukee, the one I pushed aside because I didn't want to seem paranoid, that feeling was right. It was right the whole time. I just didn't listen to it. And the other thing I've learned is this. Family doesn't automatically mean safe. Blood doesn't mean trustworthy. Love is not measured by how many holidays you show up to. It's measured by how you treat someone on the ordinary days, when nobody's watching, when there's nothing to gain. My father never learned that, and my son paid the price for it. But Noah is still here, still healing, still laughing at dinner sometimes in that way that stops me cold and reminds me exactly why I made every hard decision I made. And that's enough. That is more than enough. Now I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, if you walked into that room and saw what I saw, would you have done the same thing? Or would you have found a way to forgive him and move forward? There's no wrong answer. Every family is different. Every situation is different. But I'd really like to know what you think. Drop it in the comments. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting someone you love, share your story. Because I promise you, you are not alone. Thank you for listening.